Gentleman from New York, Mr. Garbarino, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a couple of questions for Dr. Holtz-Egan. You just heard a couple of my colleagues mention 210 billion, 200 billion in regulatory costs. But I don't think people understand, what that means in only a year. Can you explain? Can you just go a little further into, we've seen 210 billion dollars in additional regulatory costs. Can you talk about, what we've seen in previous administrations and why that 210 billion is so big?
So what we do is we keep track of all the regulatory costs as reported by the agencies themselves, and we simply total them by agency, and in this case for the federal government as a whole. We don't have complete records of the Bush administration, so that I can't comment on that. The Obama administration, as I mentioned, had about $895 billion of regulatory costs over the 8 years of its time in office. The Trump administration had, I forget the exact number, a modest double-digit increase, under $20 billion over its 4 years. And now the Biden administration, we have 1 year of data. It's $200 billion in the first year.
What was the Obama number again over 8 years?
$895 billion in new costs.
So 895 billion in new costs over 8 years.
Yes.
That's a little over 100. 20 billion over 4 years.
Yes.
For President Trump. And we're seeing 200 billion in 1 year alone under this current administration in regulatory costs. I mean, I prior to coming to Congress, I was a private practice attorney, and my in New York, which had high regulatory costs. A couple of my colleagues from New York are on this call as well, so they can also comment on the regulations coming out of New York. And we saw businesses leaving the state in droves because of these regulatory costs. I just know. I mean, can you talk about what these 200 billion in 1 year, what that will do to small businesses?
Well, we've seen some examples historically of what high regulatory costs do. So, for example, the Sarbanes-Oxley law was intended to control big businesses and their accounting practices in the aftermath of the Enron and WorldCom scandals. That was a legitimate concern and public purpose, but it's extremely costly to comply with Sarbanes-Oxley. And as a result, we've seen the number of initial public offerings cut in half since the 2000s. That means that small businesses that are starting up are less likely to be able to pay off their venture investors by going public. They're going to have to be bought by somebody or have some other method of getting the money. So that hurts small business startups. There's no question about it. And it's from the regulatory costs of compliance with a well-intended public law.
I appreciate those answers, Doctor. I want to change because when I talk to small business in my district, it's not just about high regulations, more regulations, and how tough it is to do business. But I'm really starting to hear a lot about inflation. And my question specifically for you is, are the inflation levels that we're seeing here in the U.S. unique, or is this something that's being experienced all over the world?
There has been a rise in inflation globally, but the levels in the United States and the increase in 2021 of inflation is unique to the United States. I mean, the headline number is 7.5% for consumer price inflation. If you look at the bundle of food, energy, and shelter, which is 50% of the typical family's budget, that went from 1.4 to 8.1% during the course of 2021. So it's the sharpest rise on the globe.
Wow. So the sharpest rise on the globe. So what does that do to us as a country in competitiveness? I mean,
inflation is bad news from every dimension, and this will hurt our ability to compete with other countries.
It's $210 billion in regulations and regulation cost, highest inflation compared to other countries. In 1 year, I think we're experiencing. We're definitely going the wrong way, especially in how we can help small business. I appreciate your testimony today. You're answering your questions. And thank you very much for being here. And Chairwoman, I yield back.